You're listening to the Great Reassessment Podcast.
John, thanks so much for being here, man.
Absolutely, happy to.
So, just for anybody listening, you and we met at a Bitcoin meetup here in the Pacific Northwest, and you and I have kept contact, and I'm really fascinated by what you do because you're the first developer that I've met in person and have, established a friendship with. Would you go ahead and tell people what you do as a developer?
Yeah, totally. So for the last 3 years or so, I've been working on NOSTR. And for those who aren't familiar, NOSTR is a fairly new decentralized censorship-resistant social media protocol. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways we could talk about that. But, basically what inspired me to start working on that was back in 2020, there was the whole Hunter Biden New York Post article censored on Twitter. And, Twitter's whole ethos is one of transparency and openness and public square and freedom of speech and all that kind of thing. And suddenly that was not the case in a really obvious, clear way. And I kind of looked around and said, well, I sure hope someone fixes this, and then moved on with my life. And a year later, not really much had changed, so I started looking into the space a little bit. At the time, I was a web application developer at a kind of a resale back-end sort of business company, like a B2B sort of software sort of thing. It was a small software company. But I looked into it, and there were a few things out there, but nothing really was going to scale. So, at the time it was Mastodon and Scuttlebutt were the two main things to look at. And so I said, well, I guess I'm someone, I'll go ahead and fix the problem. And so I started working on it in early 2022 and wrote my own protocol. And then shortly after that found NOSTR, which was being worked on at the time by a Brazilian developer, Bitcoin developer, and a few other people. So I eventually abandoned my own protocol, hopped on board with working on the NOSTR protocol by making a client. And then shortly after that, Jack Dorsey found the protocol. And so it kind of blew up. We got a whole bunch more developers, a bunch of users, and some money to sort of sustain the open source development. So that's what I do. It's really, whenever anyone asks me what I do for a living, I say it's complicated. I write open source software under a grant provided through a Bitcoin-specific open source software 501c3. I don't even know how to say it, but yeah, I'm trying to, more broadly, I'm trying to fix social media, which is a much bigger problem than I realized at first. Because, I was thinking about it in terms of censorship at first, but censorship is only one of the problems that's wrong with social media. You've got all kinds of other dimensions to it. I mean, a lot of them come from the advertising motive that most social media or just internet companies sort of run their business on. And downstream from that is censorship and shadow banning and algorithms and engagement farming. And downstream of that is like mental health and erosion of community and erosion of culture, detachment from reality. So we can get into any of these topics that you want, but to summarize, I told a friend of mine that I was working on social media, and he was like, "Oh, social media is basically a dog's breakfast," and I just thought that was a great phrase.
What does he mean by a dog's breakfast?
It's an old phrase. I can't remember exactly what it means, but it's like it's been floating around for 100 years, and it just basically means like it's the kind of thing that only a dog would eat. Basically, it's your best if you just opt out, which, of course, I'm really selling my product right now. But that's basically, I agree. Like, social media is a dog's breakfast. It's a total mess. People should generally just not use it. But there is something redeemable in there, I think, in terms of freedom of speech and the ability to cross-pollinate ideas between, widely different people. It does damage your belonging in community, I think, because it takes content out of context. But I think there are some salutary effects about that. And then, also I'm a Christian, so I always look at these things through that Christian lens of like, God made the world in such a way that social media technology is possible. That doesn't mean that he endorses it, but it does mean that he has called us to dominion of creation in such a way that we actually have to engage with this domain, the domain of the digital. And I don't think that just means that Christians should screech about us, not being online at all. It means that we have to think critically about how to engage with the internet, with cryptography, with big businesses, on all those different levels, and exercise dominion in a responsible and thoughtful way. So that's what I am trying to do. I'm spread way too thin, of course, developing stuff, but I also have my own podcast where I try to think through these things. And I'm also not like a great philosopher or anything. So, but yeah, if people are interested in what we talk about today, that's a good place to go. If you want to hear more of my disorganized thoughts, we read books and have guests on and stuff like that. But anyway.
No, I love that. I appreciate you explaining some of that stuff. I don't want to pretend like some of the listeners understand everything we're talking about. So I want to kind of go back to the basics when you say like things like open source, decentralized, social media. Because right now, I think whether you're 10 years old or you're 60 years old, people know what Facebook is. They know what Twitter is or X. Are those not decentralized? Are those not open source? And could you explain sort of like if somebody's, really new to all this, how is a social media open source? Like, how is that even possible?
Yeah, so I think a good place to start is just looking at the real world. If you're across the street from me, I can yell, "Hey!" and no one can stop me. People might get mad at me or something, but like the world is made in such a way that no one can stop someone else from speaking except by exercising violence, essentially. And so, the air is going to send my speech through itself as a medium, and there's nothing anyone can really do about that. That's how it's been forever. And so when you look at speech, speech is essentially uncensorable. It belongs to the person who's speaking, which means that they are free to speak, but it also means that they're responsible to speak. They're responsible for their words. Now, of course, there's like a lot of political dimensions to this where, you could throw someone in your dungeon for saying something that you don't like. But that actually means, taking that person's liberty entirely away. So your freedom to speak goes along with your liberty as a person. And in America, we, in theory, believe in liberty. So that's how speech should be. So there's the two sides of it. There's liberty and responsibility. When you go to these platforms, what happens is you're speaking through a medium that is intermediated. So when you talk on the internet, your words aren't going through the air. They're going through wires, right? So they go through the router in your house and then out through your ISP, and they use the domain name system, which has a bunch of registries that are run by people, and then they go through someone else's IP or ISP. Potentially, they go through over a cellular network. They go through someone else's router and through someone else's device. So at any of those steps, what you say can be blocked based on who you are, where you're located, what you're saying, pretty much anything like that. If you've heard of the Great Firewall of China, that is kind of how that works. They have circumscribed the infrastructure of the internet in China such that they analyze what the traffic is doing and block some of it. And when you take... So that's one thing, and the internet is actually pretty amazingly decentralized already, because if you own all those hops between you and someone else, then you own the entire medium, and no one can stop you from transmitting data that way. In practice, that's not usually possible, but also in practice, a lot of the infrastructure providers in the United States have to be neutral. So there's Section 230 basically protects infrastructure providers from liability for what content they host. So even if someone posts threats or, terrorist content or something on the internet or on a server or uses an ISP to transmit that data, the ISP is not liable, which is, I think, a good thing. It gets really complicated. But then, if you move to social media platforms, that gets a little fuzzier because social media platforms have a brand, they have algorithms to hide or show content, and so they've appealed to this same Section 230 sort of net neutrality stuff to say we're not liable for anything that people say on our platform, but they also exercise their control and their ability to elevate or lower voices. And to a certain extent, I think that's fine. Like, if you're providing a valuable service and you want to amplify or silence certain people, like that's kind of your prerogative. I think what the problem is that we as just internet users have opted into using these centralized providers who, they mediate that medium that we're using to talk to each other. So if I try to send you an email message and your email provider, like Google or something, doesn't like me, it's not going to get through. And so because we have allowed ourselves to be captured by these platforms, we've also given up our ability to speak freely. We've also given up our ability to hang on to our own attention. So when you're on a social media website or you do a Google search or something, there's all these ads that pop up that they cost you mental bandwidth and potentially trick you into clicking on the wrong thing. So there are costs to these mediated platforms. And so something like Twitter, for example, to be more specific, Donald Trump was deplatformed from Twitter. Twitter was this huge platform where Trump could speak in all caps to his heart's content and have millions of people listening. And during like the beginning of this decade, he was banned from Twitter. So he lost that platform. And that's just kind of a crazy thing that a private company could ban a sitting president, arguably the most powerful person in the world, and he didn't have recourse. Now, I guess there are good things about that, because the flip side is that you don't want a single executive being able to do whatever he wants. But deplatforming someone like that, who, he has the White House press office and stuff. It's not like you're really shutting him down. It's just kind of a bizarre asymmetry of power that Twitter could do something like that. And that isn't solved. A lot of people on the right, more conservative leaning, are really excited about Elon Musk because of Doge, and he bought Twitter, and so he's restoring everyone's free speech rights. And it's really just simply not the case. Musk just censors different people. If people speak ill of Elon, then their engagement and exposure on Twitter immediately goes down. Like, you can see charts of engagement. The moment someone speaks ill of Musk, they get shadow banned from Twitter, basically. He's also banned a lot of people in Turkey at Turkey's behest. So, things appear a lot nicer from an American perspective, but they haven't essentially changed at all. It's just a different guy behind the curtain operating things. So, and the reason Twitter is able to do this is because of technical reasons, right? They have the company, they have the business model, they've used the business to make money so that they can buy servers. They own the servers and they control them. They have the login access to them, and no one else does. And so if you want to route your speech through these servers, then they can decide whether or not you are able to do that. So it's centralized in the sense not that they only have servers in one place where, like a bomb could destroy all of Twitter's infrastructure. They're globally distributed across the world, but a very few number of people have the choke points for accessing and using that infrastructure itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good way for people to understand, is like these choke points. Like your initial example was, you can go outside and you can shout, and you have the air essentially is carrying your sound waves and delivering your message to the world. But when you use a platform like Facebook or Twitter, it's almost like you're speaking into a pipe or something, and they have the control to stop your message or let it go through if they agree with it or if it doesn't offend them. And so NOSTR is a social media that removes all those things, however inflammatory, whatever your message is. The medium of the internet, you can think of the internet as the air, and it's allowed to propagate. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's you got pipes all over the place heading in all kinds of different directions, and so it's a little bit more complicated to use because you're not speaking into just this single well, but it does route around any kind of choke points that there might be. And like, just to be clear, like, I don't think the solution, well, I guess obviously because I'm working on NOSTR, but I don't think the solution to censorship is a lot of policy. I kind of think that people who are hosting content have the prerogative to host whatever content they want. I'm not necessarily 100% against net neutrality because there are certain infrastructure providers that operate at a scale that really you can't compete with, at least not yet, although that would put pressure on people to build things like mesh networks, which I think should have more investment. But yeah, I mean, forcing people to host stuff that they don't want to do, like this, it's their business. It's up to the user who doesn't want to be censored or who wants to access information that would otherwise be censored to route around it themselves. And so, like, just like with Bitcoin, this decentralized social media approach requires a little bit more responsibility from individual people. And I haven't really figured out if that's a overly optimistic view of what people are willing to do, or if we can accommodate the simplicity and ease with which people kind of expect to engage the internet. But yeah, it does require a little bit more responsibility. Yeah. But
Okay.
yeah, as far as like NOSTR goes in the architecture, it is it sort of creates redundancy. So instead of having one big ball of infrastructure that's controlled by very few people, you have a bunch of tiny little ones all over the place that are controlled by different people. And if you're familiar with Mastodon, it's sort of similar to that, except on Mastodon, your identity belongs to one of those servers. So even if you can cross-post to other servers, you can still be silenced by having your identity revoked. And then you have to kind of like start over from scratch on some other server that's willing to have you, and then potentially get banned from there. And so you just become a digital nomad, sort of roaming, well, in a different sense, roaming from one server to another. On NOSTR, this server redundancy is managed by giving the end user their identity. Like, you actually hold your identity. It's not issued to you by anyone else. And the way that's done is through public key cryptography, which is a fascinating subject and really very different from what most people are used to. I remember the first time I used it as a developer 15 years ago, and I had no idea what was happening. So maybe we can get into that a little bit, but basically, what you're used to is having other people issue you identification. So if a cop pulls you over, you hand them your driver's license, which was issued to you by the state via the DMV. And that driver's license is printed in such a way with identification numbers and watermarks and stuff that the cop can be reasonably sure that it's legitimate and not fake. And that's where you get counterfeiting. Counterfeiting is attempting to make an issuer of authority say something that they didn't say. So they give you an authority that's not actually legitimate. Same thing with like logins on the internet. If you log into your bank, that username and password is issued to you by your bank, and they can change it whenever they want. They can look at it. They can, well, I guess if they hash your password properly, they can't look at it, but they can revoke it at any time. And so what cryptographic identities does is it allows you to keep your identity, and even if someone else decides to stop recognizing it, they can't stop anyone else from recognizing your identity. So you can get partially deplatformed now instead of totally deplatformed, which is a huge step forward.
So Did you know that when you were getting into coding and developing that you were going to enter upon this journey rabbit trail of fighting for freedom, essentially the freedom for privacy, the freedom freedom of speech. Did you know that that's kind of like what you were going to get into? Because that's what I hear at the heart of all this is privacy, freedom, and to resist censorship and things like that. When you were learning to code, did you think that this was where you were going to end up?
No, absolutely not. When I was learning to code, it was all just a game. It was fun. I like programming languages. I like designing languages even, and writing databases and just kind of doodling around. I've played around with lots of different projects, and when I got into NOSTR, I kind of thought maybe it would be the same sort of thing where it was like, this is a hobby. It's fun to play with. But, before 2020, I really did not care about any of this stuff. It's not that I actively had a different set of values, but it was like, I'm an American. All this is guaranteed to me and everything's going to be okay. And 2020 showed me that no, everything's not just going to be okay. We actually have to do stuff in order to keep our freedom. And, I first got into Bitcoin because the pump had been primed by my dad's interest in Ron Paul when I was a kid. I voted for Ron Paul the first 2 times I voted for a president. And to this day, he's like the only politician that I have anything more than a neutral level of respect for, because not because of his policies so much as his integrity. He is a really honest guy who actually cares, and he's not out to just make money or exploit the system. And I respect that a ton. It resonates a lot with me. And when in 2020, when I saw an insane amount of attacks on civil liberty motivated by corruption, essentially, that led me into Bitcoin, and that made me realize that many, many systems are equally corrupt. And and I don't really want to live in that world. I don't want my kids to live in that world. And I have a certain set of skills that I can apply. I think there's lots of things that regular people should do who don't have any particular skills, but also like politicians or policymakers or, business owners, stuff like that. And I've come to the conclusion that, well, it's easy, I think, as a Christian to think that what you do doesn't matter. And this seems to bother some people and not others, but it bothers me a lot. The basic gospel is that all our good works are filthy rags, right? There's nothing that we as fallen humans can do that actually produces any good or fixes any of the evil that we've done. I totally affirm that. Jesus came, he died on the cross for our sins, so that we could be, first of all, saved and brought into his family. But later, the Bible says that he's prepared good works for us, that we should walk in them. And I think it's easy for Christians to spiritualize that and say that those good works are just, the fruit of the Spirit. And yes, they are primarily the fruit of the Spirit, but we're not just spirits kind of hanging out in the world until it all goes belly up and we can go to heaven and get out of it. We are people in physical bodies, and Jesus affirmed the goodness of the physical body by inhabiting one himself to the point where he's still in a physical body, sitting at the right hand of God. So I think we have a duty as Christians and a responsibility to apply the fruit of the Spirit that God is giving us to actual physical things. Jesus says, if anyone gives a cup of cold water in my name, his reward won't be taken from him. And so, as a Christian, you look around at your work and you say, well, what are the cups of cold water that I can give? What are the specific works that I can do that follow from my faith and from the grace that God has given me in Jesus? And then you do them. That's a result of faith. It's not contrary to faith. And so, especially as someone who is in a prosperous nation where I have the ability to save and the ability to work freely rather than, do whatever someone else has told me in order to just barely survive, I have amazing privileges and amazing gifts. So I'm the guy with the 5 talents, not the guy with 1 talent. So what am I going to do with those talents? Well, I'm going to program because that's one of my talents. But how exactly can I do that? And I think it's something that every person should look at their lives and say, like, what am I working for? What am I spending my energy and my purchasing power for? And it's not about like sort of the leftist constant revolution of let's change the world. It's, in what way is God's grace going to work its way out of my fingertips?
I love everything you're saying. It actually sort of is reminiscent of the speech you gave at an event I recently saw you at. So, ran into you in North Idaho. There was a "What Hath Bitcoin to Do with Jerusalem?" That was the title of the event, and you spoke, Jordan spoke, and could you sort of give your speech was I remember on technological optimism, and could you give people sort of maybe the spark notes of what you spoke about that night? Because I thought it was really good. A lot of people look towards the future. They see AI, they see technology advancing so rapidly, and they're scared. And a lot of Christians are too. They think, for whatever reason, that this is going to be harmful, that we are going to lose a lot of liberties and freedoms and just things like that. But your take, I thought, was really helpful. So could you kind of, what was your speech about?
Yeah, so it's kind of a hobby of mine to pick on materialism, just because it's easy. It's an easy win. Materialism is super dumb, and at the same time, a lot of people explicitly believe it, and many more people who don't explicitly believe it, who would explicitly reject materialism, kind of live on materialism's terms, including myself. It's very hard not to in a modern society. And, the idea of materialism is basically that the material world is the fundamental structure of reality. It's base reality, and everything is emergent from it. Consciousness is just a result of emergent complexity of a bunch of material stuff running into itself and turning into life and consciousness. And what that means is that if material reality is the base structure of reality, then purpose or fulfillment or eternity, none of those things can exist because they aren't explained by material reality. But there are a lot of other ideas, like metaphysical ideas, that are more explanatory than mere material reality, and in fact implied by the existence of structured material reality. An easy one is math. Math is not just inherent in material. It can be abstracted out of it and understood separately from it. Math is a principle that is complementary with the material world, because without it, we would just live in a undifferentiated soup, which is clearly not the case. And so I like to think about ontology and epistemology and all that kind of stuff, because when I don't know, God has given me a hunger for meaning and purpose, and I'm not sure if that's a calling or if that's a character flaw, but in either case, I'm always looking like, why does what I'm doing matter? Like I was talking about earlier. And it matters because God is transcendent and he's beyond the material world. There's another verse, in him we live and move and have our being, right? So the whole natural world is completely downstream from the character of God. And it's really hard for people to wrap their head around who God is if they haven't really been educated on what the classical view of God actually is. God is not just a big guy. Like he's not material. He's not just older. He is ultimate, and I think that's language that people understand. People want to be in touch with the ultimate truth, and often find themselves going there through some kind of pantheism. But that's what God is. God is the thing that is self-existent, that never began, and who is the origin of everything that we understand. So, there's the transcendent virtues, which are truth, beauty, and goodness. And those things are not material things. They're evaluative. And in order for something in the material world to be true, beautiful, or good, it has to conform to God himself. And there's also an important doctrine called creatio ex nihilo, which means that God did not make the world out of himself. He did not beget the world. The world is not part of God. The world is separate from God and sustained by God. And what that means is that we're not God, right? It's really, really important to realize that you cannot find truth, beauty, and goodness by looking into yourself. There are imprints that God has given us that have truth, beauty, and goodness in them, but they're all derivative. They all point back to the source. And so, when we look forward now towards heaven, people have this view of heaven of like, we go to heaven and we get our harp and our robe and we sit there on a cloud, bored out of our minds while we sing holy, holy, holy for billions and billions and billions of years. And I mean, that's kind of sort of accurate, except it completely misses the point that if our eyes and being are fixed on God, who is the source of all truth, beauty, and goodness, then that blows out of the water completely all of our experience of truth, beauty, and goodness in this world, right? Like sunsets, mountains, your wife, your kids, the like leatherworking and carpentry, all of that stuff, as gratifying as it is totally derivative of God's person. And yet, at the same time, God does not destroy our given being when we enter into heaven with him. He affirms it. He says, you're separate, but you are permanently and eternally with me in heaven when we're saved. And so at the beginning, God didn't have to make the world, but he did. At the end, God doesn't have to keep the world, but he does. So we have the world, the physical material world, or maybe a better word would be corporeal. It's suspended in God's being. It's separate from it, but it's suspended in it. And so we have to look back and we have to look forward. Looking back is memory. Looking forward is imagination. So when we exercise memory, we remember what has happened and especially what God has told us. He's given us his word. He's given us Jesus as an example as well as a savior. And we have to look back and we have to understand this is how the world is made and this is how it ought to function. And then we use that memory to then exercise our imagination and ask, what could it look like in the future? And what should it look like in the future? And so if you isolate either of those things from the other, you get just memory in the one place, which is inert and can't really do anything. And then on the other hand, you get imagination untethered from memory. And so I think, memory is a conservative impulse, and imagination is a progressive impulse. Conservatives can't do anything interesting in the culture because they have no imagination. Progressives can do a lot of interesting things, but they're all destructive and end up, being self-destructive, and because they've forgotten what came before. So we have to reconcile those two things in a physical world as physical, natural creatures, but to the glory of God. And the only way I've been able to think about actually reconciling those things is, because God made us out of nothing, he doesn't need us. He interacts with us and sustains us by just his own pleasure. And so anything that we do, all of our works, are unnecessary in those terms. Like, God hasn't sent us to do work such that we can offer it up to him and say, look, I checked it off. Like, you don't have to worry. I got it covered. Our works are a lot more like prayer. And one of the objections to prayer, practical objections, is why pray if God already knows what you need? And Jesus even says this, like, your Father already knows what you need before you even ask. But he says, ask anyway. God wants to hear from you. God loves you. Prayer is a way of being elevated into the being and fellowship of God. And so I think our work is the same thing. We offer up our work to God as a way of glorifying or being glorified. And it is basically, we make a bunch of material stuff from material stuff, and then that is brought into the glory of God's transcendent goodness. And I think, C.S. Lewis is much better at saying these things than I am, so maybe go read some C.S. Lewis after this. But we have this material world in which we live, and it is being transformed. The world groans in anticipation of being fulfilled, of seeing God face to face. And if we don't cry out, the stones themselves are going to cry out. So, that can apply to any sort of work, whatever kind of work you do. It should be done as a prayer. It should be offered up to God. But technology is a kind of work. It's an extension of man, an extension of our agency. And so to that extent, our technology should reflect an imagination that is informed by the memory of who we actually are.
I can't wait have you posted that speech anywhere yet?
No, it still hasn't come out yet.
Yeah,
I think Jordan is a little too busy right now.
Because, man, there's just so much there for people to sort of be inspired by, I think. And thinking of technology as reflecting our work, and our work reflecting prayer. And that's, we're invited to pray, not because God needs it, but because it invites us into a relationship with Him, and our work takes on those same aspects. And man, that's just something really good to chew on. You were talking about memory and people looking back, and then there's a desire to look forward. And as you were talking, the thing that was coming to my mind is like people's desire to be a part of a story. And I think that's where a lot of people get depression, because they don't feel like they're a part of a story. I can't remember where, I think it was Al Mohler who was talking about, this was a couple years ago, but there was in Ireland, I think, they were talking about this time capsule they were going to bury in the ground. And tens of thousands of people were submitting things to be selected to be put in here. And some of the people were just simply putting their name on a piece of paper because they didn't have any offspring. And the thing that frightened them was that after they die, nobody will ever read their name again. And that's one of the easy wins on materialism, is you have this imprint inside you to like look forward to something. You have eternity written on your heart. You desperately want to move forward in some way, but you're also really depressed because according to your worldview, you don't. And you have no offspring to sort of, with no hope that they will remember you. And so I think that's really interesting. What do you think about stories and people's desire to be a part of them?
Yeah, well, I agree. I think work is telling a story in a way, and it's a way of attempting to live forever. There's a temptation that goes along with impactful, dignified, recognized work. If you're someone that a lot of people know about, so you have fame, or you have a lot of wealth, or you did something that, it's software that everyone in the world uses every day. Like my dad worked on Windows NT, so code that he wrote is in every Windows computer out there still, which is kind of cool. And but the danger is that you start to flatter yourself and think that you've done it. You've actually you are eternal. You are going to live forever now. And of course, we know deep down that that's not true. So even the people who do rest on their laurels are still driven to continue to accumulate wealth or fame or whatever it might be. And that's idolatry, and an idol never satisfies. It just takes more and more of us. And so we have to be really careful that when we're trying to participate in eternity and to become eternal ourselves, we need to become eternal in the way that God has offered eternity to us. We need to offer our works up to Him, not hold on to them and kind of flout them. We can be eternal, but we have to live by dying. We have to go through death in order to get there. And Jesus made the way for us. So if we follow Him, we're going to be okay, and we are going to live forever. And the really cool thing about that is like it makes it possible for anyone to feel like they are part of that eternal perfect story, and to be a part of it, without denigrating the value of good work. It's still worth doing work with dignity and with impact, because all the people that you're affecting through your work are eternal beings. They're going to live forever, one way or another. And to the extent that your work shapes the world, your work in turn shapes people and is part of that story. So, um, it's kind of like the idea of storing up treasure in heaven. Well, what do we need treasure in heaven for if our works are worthless and Jesus is the only treasure? It's kind of a weird paradox, and I don't know how that in particular works, but I do know that working well, both in the way that you approach your work and in what kind of work you do is valuable. But yeah, like everyone is part of this story, and no one is going to be forgotten because, again, we live in Him. We live and move and have our being. God knows us, and so we don't have to worry that we're forgotten. If we don't feel like we have work that's dignifying or satisfying, turn to prayer, because that is dignifying and satisfying, much more than any work can be. And of course, the more dignifying and satisfying your work is, probably the more likely you are to neglect prayer. And I know that's true of my own life. So yeah, it's a huge challenge to use the good things that God has given us as a way of growing closer to Him and glorifying Him, rather than glorifying ourselves. Yeah, it's a sticky path for sure.
I think that's a good message for anybody out there wrestling with this idea that this is all there is. This is the only thing. We have this life and nothing else. And this functional depression that their story ends, that he or she does not get to participate in eternity. I like the way you said that. And just know that there is a God who knows you and wants you to know Him. And that's just to sum all that whole thing up, just to sum everything up that we've been talking about. Turn to Christ, get to know Him through His Word, and you can find rest because you can look beyond this world. I kind of want to.
Yeah, I was talking to someone a couple years ago, and they were a new Christian. They asked me, like, one thing I don't get is why heaven and hell. Like, if we're so satisfied in God and knowing Him, then why do we need to live forever? And I was like, well, like, why not? Why, if God is satisfied with you and you're satisfied with God, like, why not just continue that? And so that's why we go on forever into eternity is because it's a good thing. And so, and also, like, if you look back, you came from somewhere, and so it's symmetrical and it's reasonable to think that you're going somewhere too. And we have this because we believe in materialism and the lie that life and consciousness comes from just soup. We believe that we're going back to soup, but life can't come from soup. That's not how entropy works. Everything goes from a state of more order to less order. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And so, if you're ordered, if you're conscious, if you're here, that had to come from somewhere. It has to be fueled by something. And yes, the trajectory of the material world is downwards, but we haven't accounted for that agent that actually brought something out of nothing first. So I think that can be a source of hope as well.
Yeah, that is a good source of hope. And I might just add that we are invited to know God and enjoy Him forever, right? And God is the perfect eternal embodiment of everything that is good. And so for us to share in witnessing that cannot be contained. It cannot be time bound. And so it necessarily must be forever, because if it was, hey, we die and then we go into this spiritual realm and there's this being there and we worship Him, it's somehow limited because it ends. That can't be a God because it's not infinite. God has to be infinite, and therefore heaven must be eternal and it must never end. And maybe there's a better way to articulate that, but that's just sort of my instinct as I kind of want to switch gears here. Do you think now is a good time to start coding and starting to learn how to code?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I honestly don't know. I mean, obviously, AI looms large in the background here. Um, I've seen some pretty impressive vibe coded apps recently from non-coders. Um, but I think that coding it's still worth learning. It's not quite the same sort of asymmetrical superpower that it used to be, maybe. But there's a lot more to programming than just writing a bunch of code that does stuff that instructs the machine how to say things. Coding is primarily about communication. When you're working with a programming language, you're practicing speaking not only to the computer but to other people in as clear and concise and understandable a way as you can. So it involves building abstractions, creating mental models, and LLMs can imitate a lot of that, but they can't actually do that work of real language. The work that they do is reductive and derivative, and so
Sorry,
it's
what is
like an AI, like a chat generating.
Okay.
Yeah, an LLM is a large language model. So it's one of those things where you can chat with it, and it looks like it's really smart, but it hallucinates, and it gets all of that output from an insane amount of input. And those things I think are really useful, but they're going to end up being more of a tool for programmers than a replacement, I think, because programmers, well, people have agency. So this kind of goes back to that materialistic thing. A chatbot, an LLM is derivative. It is physical, and it's a machine. But God has made us with a spark of the divine, and He's given us freedom and the ability to choose, and also the responsibility to choose. We have values and morals that we have to actually execute. And so, this just strengthens my argument about how everything that we do matters, because as technology overtakes our ability to physically, mechanically do things in the world, that faculty that we have of judgment becomes more and more important. And so, James Poulos talks about this as catechizing the bots. The bots can't just go and do whatever they want because, anytime you measure something, you start to optimize your actions towards the measurement rather than the thing that begat the measurement in the first place, like the value system. If you lose track of the value system that's behind the measurement, and humans can, hopefully remember those values, but machines have no ability to value anything. So they're always going to optimize, and the common apocalyptic version of this is the robots are going to turn all the matter in the galaxy into paper clips, because they were just tasked with making as many paper clips as possible. So when it comes to programming, a lot of it is talking to people, finding out what they actually need, what their problems are, how to coordinate with other people, how to deploy capital, how to create marketing materials that resonate with people such that they feel like they're part of a story. These are all things that LLMs can help with and imitate, but they're never going to essentially displace the human direction and agency.
Okay. So maybe it's a good time for, like, I'm just thinking of teenagers, right? Who they are fascinated by technology. They look at people now who have learned to code, and they might be asking, is this a worthwhile investment for me to spend my time learning to learn how to write JavaScript, Python, some of the other ones, or can you get all that from AI, and maybe now it's having AI write the code, and maybe you're more of the programmer?
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do. If you want to bash out a prototype or a tool that makes your life easier, then yeah, just like vibe code it, throw it into an LLM and see what comes out. And even if it doesn't work perfectly, then you've kind of accomplished your mission. If you want to grow as a person, then studying something, whether it's programming or some other discipline, is well worth doing. I went to a liberal arts school, and the idea of liberal arts is it's an education that makes you free. And so we read a lot of history and a lot of philosophy and stuff like that, which was helpful for sort of contextualizing the current world. But I think, hard skills are just as useful for being free. If you know how to code, then you know how to solve your own digital problems. And that means that you're not beholden to the platforms or the solutions that are already out there. And, in that sense, LLMs are actually a tool for liberal arts too. You're not internalizing how to make stuff at a lower level, but you are internalizing how to make stuff at a higher level, and that gives you agency in the world. So in that sense, it's a really good thing. But, like last week, I was reading about cryptography, reading the RSA algorithm that was written in the mid 1970s. It's the original public key cryptography. And I just decided I'm going to implement an 8-bit version of this by hand on paper. And I did. There is no conceivable use for this. But it's a beautiful algorithm. It's very simple. And it gives me a level of depth and understanding the kind of work that I'm doing that's derived from that idea of cryptography, asymmetric cryptography. So, it's worth learning. It's worth enjoying. So much of entertainment has turned into like addiction and dopamine stimulation that, to the extent that you're training yourself to be active in the world and not a passive consumer of it, I think anything is good. Even if it doesn't have a practical outlet. And I do think coding still does have a practical outlet.
Yeah, and it's just, even if it has no real world use, but at least learning something to peel back the layers to look at something, it just gives you a richer understanding, and you can really apply that to anything. I see that with my kids all the time. Like, they're asking questions because, you flip a light switch on, and all you know is that when you push that switch up, this light turns on. But, my 4-year-old is even asking questions like, how does that happen? And electrician things are not like things I know a lot about, but I know a little bit, and I don't know how much she'll understand if I explain it to her. But there's other things like that, So I think it's totally worthwhile to, like you were saying, do that thing on paper and just send your knowledge of it just a few layers deeper, so you can understand it like just on a deep conceptual level.
That's an important thing about understanding what memory is. Memory is not just how do you know that you have access to particular information. That's not memory. That's data. That's like externalized. But memory is really internalized. So when you try to remember or memorize something, your ultimate goal is not to have access to this data or information, which is increasingly less relevant since we have so much access to information. The purpose is to change who you are. So, someone said, like, everything that you do is a vote for the kind of person you want to be. And I think that's a good way to think about memory. It's like every activity that you engage in is a vote for the kind of person you want to become, both in terms of skills and in terms of character. So, you should have a goal or a vision for what kind of person you want to be, and then do the things that support that. If that means that you want to be someone who's involved in shaping technology, then learn to code. Maybe coding is going to become obsolete and it's not actually going to be the thing that allows you to shape technology, but it is going to inform you. And maybe eventually you'll be a vibe coder, or maybe you'll go super low level and you'll be the bit fiddler in operating system development. Or maybe you'll take that knowledge and turn it into a career in journalism or marketing or politics or something. It's not a waste of time if the skill that you learn doesn't end up being exactly what you thought it was. And again, this is like that story thing. You're part of a story. God has a plan for your life. And if you go through it being fearful that the thing that you would like to do is not going to turn out to be worth anything, then you're not really trusting God to direct your paths. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. So learn coding if you feel called to it, if you feel interested in it, if you got the time and the means to do it, then go ahead. And the landscape is going to change, but it doesn't mean that it's a totally obsolete skill.
And it might even be worth it in the same way that if you wanted to get into music, sometimes you have to go all the way back to the fundamentals and research who were the pioneers of certain things. Like who was the first person to sort of lay the terrain that allowed this field to emerge. And as you do that, like it'll just, if anything, it'll give you a greater appreciation for the field, even if it's not something you use on a day-to-day basis. But like your knowledge of it is just really deep, and you're sort of started where they started, but you get to continue the path. And so maybe that's why it would be worth learning to code. I really like what you said about data and memory. I think most of today, a lot of the information that we're taking in is taken in passively, and it's either entertainment or you got caught just binge scrolling and you're taking in information that isn't really going to shape you as a person, but it's scratching that itch of productivity, even though it's not real productivity. But when I think about all the information that I've taken in, that even if I took it in years ago, it still influences my thoughts. It's like the substance of my thoughts. And those things, when you talk about data and memory, I would classify those as memory. I've read a lot of influential books that just I read a passage and it changed the whole way I look at the world, and it really influences what I do going forward, and I can recall it when I need it. But data, maybe it still lives in your mind, but you have no real use for it, and except for maybe some random fact at trivia. But the more nonsensical information we take in, there's just more data to have to search through when we are recalling information. But I really like I like that distinction a lot. I'm going to try to hold on to that, data versus memory. Do you have any other thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I don't think there is such a thing as data if it's in your mind. There's data that's outside, that's externalized, that you can refer to. Think of like a reference manual. With circuit diagrams for some particular thing that you have to work on. That's data. It's sitting there. It's inert. It's not really doing anything. And if you need to fix the thing, then you go and look at it and refer to it. And if you happen to remember some of that, then you become the kind of person who remembers that kind of stuff, who has like slightly better understanding of circuit diagrams, or the trivia example. Like, yeah, who cares about this particular fact? But by knowing that fact, I've become the kind of person who's better at trivia quizzes, and it's a meaningful thing. And the risk is that maybe if you fill yourself with trivia, you become trivia yourself. So like, yeah, meditating too much on the wrong things means that you become like those things. There's another phrase people say: we become like what we worship. And if you meditate on God, you're going to become more like God. And if you meditate on a bunch of trivialities, you're going to become more like those trivialities. But there's also a way in which we meditate on things. And, meditation is kind of a deep, slow, it's active, but it's, you're sort of like, you're soaking in the thing that you're meditating on. But then there's also sort of the scrolling, or very short, distraction oriented sort of engagement with potentially the same information. And I've been studying this a lot the last couple of years. We read Marshall McLuhan for my podcast, and he talks about how the medium is the message, right? So you may be reading the Bible, but are you reading 10 chapters slowly over the course of 5 hours and writing a paraphrase of it so that you can understand it deeply and make it your own? Or are you scrolling like a tiny little screen for 5 minutes at a time? Or are you listening to an audiobook version of it? All those different ways of engaging with the text shape how the text comes into your mind and soul, and actually changes you into a different person depending on how you've actually absorbed that information. Nicholas Carr wrote a book a long time ago, 2008, called The Shallows, and he cites a lot of academic studies where people test the effects of the internet on memory, and it turns out that hyperlinks and other kinds of distractions like that actually inhibit your ability to form long-term memory. So you process more information more quickly, but you end up retaining a lot less of it. And you also break down your ability to engage and process and retain memory. And so, you can end up becoming an empty person with not much in your head by engaging all the time with lots of tiny little pieces of information. And I say this as someone who listens to podcasts at 2x speed and scrolls social media. So it's not like a virtue thing, but it is like something you really have to be careful about giving yourself over to.
But do you listen to your Bible at 2x speed? That's the real question.
I do not. I read my Bible first thing in the morning, but I mean, I'll tell you, it's hard because of my scrolling and podcasts. I have a hard time reading my Bible in long chunks. It's actually more work than it used to be when I was younger and wasn't listening to podcasts. So I've become the kind of person who is who's a podcast and social media kind of person to a certain extent. Like I still like books, but that is actually the cost of engaging with a lot of content.
Yeah, I think it takes, you have to find the proper balance because, I mean, this has been the trajectory we've been on for the last 150 years. Really, ever since the telegraph came out and it allowed information to be shared at multiples of greater speeds, like the telegraph it allowed messages to be transmitted so much faster. And one of the problems with that was people became preoccupied with things that had nothing to do with them. All of a sudden, people in Boston are like, "Hey, did you see that somebody killed somebody down in Atlanta?" When knowing that information has zero impact on your life. It might be sad, it might be really good news, but it has no immediate consequences for your life. And knowing that propositional fact or narrative does nothing for you as a person. And pretty much just the rate at which information is able to spread has just gone. It's just been a history of it getting faster and faster and faster. I read a book called Entertaining Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
Mhm.
And man, talk about connecting with a book. This book just, I felt like it was speaking to my soul because wrote this book in the 80s or 90s. And really, the big topic of conversation at that time was television. What is television doing to our kids? And how just look at the type of thinkers people were 100 years ago. Our society used to be made up of text-based thinkers. You know, if you read Abraham Lincoln's speeches, the way he spoke was pretty much like the same way people write on paper. And he talks about the Lincoln Douglas debates. These were presidential debates that lasted 6, 7, 8 hours. One person got 2 hours for an intro, the other person got an hour to rebut, and people would go home for dinner and they would come back to finish the debate. And so people's minds were, the mental stamina they had to take in information, like just text-based information, was much greater. But now we're transitioning to image-based media, and I think that's poses a real problem if it's not handled responsibly. But it's just a continuation of this trajectory we've been on for a really long time, and it started with television, but at least you were able to turn that off. Now we have phones in our pockets that we are really entertaining ourselves to death, as he talks about in that book. And it takes a lot of discipline to turn it off, to use it responsibly, and it's totally possible. Like I know people who use their phones and they engage with the internet in a very responsible way. But man, it's hard, and it's easier to do once you're in a good routine of it. And because when I'm spending less time on my phone and I'm spending more time reading or journaling, I don't know how to describe it, but like I feel like my brain just works better. And the conversations I'm able to have, things are more easily recalled to my memory, and it gives me more substance to talk about. And I just find myself less impulsive.
Yeah, definitely. And like it's there is, I don't know, there's a certain amount of like fatalism that you can have with when you look at these emerging technologies and say like, oh, it's going to destroy everything. But people adapt and people contextualize new technologies, and I don't think that there's kind of two ways to think about technology, two ditches. There's technological determinism, where it's like the logic of the tool overwhelms human agency, and will end with technological dominance. And then there's technological neutrality, which is like, nah, technology is just tools that allow people to do the stuff that they want to accomplish. And really, the truth is a mixture of the two. human agency is active all the time, but tools do have a logic of their own, and they exist in dialectic with us. We speak our tools, and then our tools speak back to us. And one way that someone has said this is we shape our tools instrumentally, so for a particular purpose, and then our tools shape us formally. They create the conditions under which we are formed and become the people that we're becoming. And, a really interesting part of this is that even if you do disengage, the tools still are shaping you because they shape the environment that you live in. They shape the categories we think in, and they also shape, the opportunities that are presented to us. So, I don't have a LinkedIn account, but the fact that LinkedIn exists means that there are fewer job opportunities available to me outside of LinkedIn. And so same thing with social media. I quit Facebook in 2017, and I stopped getting invited to things, just like full stop. I missed everything for like a year because I'd no longer existed. And so just because you opt out of a particular medium doesn't mean that medium has opted out of you. It's like when Matt Odell talks about like politics cares about you, even if you don't care about politics. Mm-hmm. And so, Nicholas Carr explores this idea a lot in his book Super Bloom from last year, where, the super bloom is where the poppies bloom in California on this particular hillside, and it's really beautiful. And a bunch of social media influencers go there, not to experience the super bloom, but to partake in the hashtag super bloom. So the internet has led to the creation of all these sort of virtual, simulated, abstract, nominal spaces that don't actually have any like reality or connection to reality, except to borrow the things in reality in order to create this nominal sort of idea that we can participate in a social way. And that's just kind of that's how it is. And I think it's, I'm inclined to say that it's bad. But I think there are redeeming qualities to this stuff that if we can learn how to if we can allow them to speak back to us and actually listen, then we can speak back into this environment and shape it into something else. It's easy after 1,000 years, or like 500 years of the printing press, 2,000 years of the written word, to be really attached to the written word. But before that, there were lots of societies that existed in by using oral communication, and they had different capabilities and different values. And, that's not inherently worse than linear communication, just as digital communication isn't inherently worse than written. So I think we have to hold our value judgments with an open hand until we actually understand the thing that we're working with. And that is a huge challenge because anytime you'll watch an old sci-fi movie and they predict the future, it's hard not to laugh because it's always just so affected by the idioms of the time. Like Star Trek is just full of stuff like this. Marshall McLuhan, he understood technology in the 1960s better than anyone else could, but he still wasn't able to predict the future. So we should try to predict the future, but we should also come at it with an element of humility and also of understanding that it's not the first order effects of any technology that are the important ones, because those are pretty predictable. It's the second and third order effects of technology. We set out to accomplish a particular thing, but then there are all kinds of unintended consequences. We see that with the internet. We see that with industrialized farming. Tractors have destroyed the family farm. That's a huge deal. No one really expected that. But that's the case. So
yeah, I referenced to the book just a second ago by Neil Postman, and I think it goes along with what you're saying. There's a concept he talks about in the book. We have created. Let's make sure that the solutions, the new technologies, actually solve a problem that exists. Right? He gives this illustration about how he went to go buy a new car, and he's selling him on the car how it has all the new gadgets. And he goes, yeah, it even has power windows. This was at a time when power windows were just coming out. And he goes, well, what problem does that solve? He said, well, the problem of having to go like this. And so sometimes what we think of as solutions, I think it's helpful to ask, like, does this solve an actual problem that is worth fixing? Or is this actually a significant problem? And then what are, like you're saying, the second and third order effects of this potential solution? I mean, and you can look at any technology that, there was one time where people thought TV is the best medium for education. You're never going to have to leave your house. Kids can learn anything as much as they want. And sure, maybe there's a world where that's possible, but that's not what happened. And kids got really addicted, and then, marketing got involved, and they saw it as a medium to market to kids for different products. And it just, so there's so many things that we have to be humble that we need to wait until it can be fully viewed with hindsight, and so we don't know, and we have to accept our own limitations with things like that, I think.
Yeah, and I think the way you do that is not by thinking really hard and anticipating what might happen because of your actions, because it's just like, that's impossible. It's way too complex. And also, what ends up happening depends not on you or the technology, but it depends on other people. How are other people gonna react to it? How are they gonna adopt this thing and repurpose it for their own purposes? Like those things are all completely out of your control and can't really be anticipated. It's almost like trying to centrally plan an economy. It's like, it's inefficient because you don't have the information. That's why we need prices, and we need individual economic actors within an economy to discover the price. And so I think in the same way with new technologies, the best thing you can do with the technology is to always loop the user in. So, creating technologies that either replace individual expertise or replace individual agency always end up going wrong, because the human is not there to correct the system. But if the technology is built around empowering a particular person or kind of person to do something that they want to do, then what you're saying, well, it's a humble approach to technology, to technology, because you're saying my will as the technologist, the person who's designing this thing, doesn't matter, but the will of the person who is using the tool is what matters. There's a balance between the agency of the technologist and the agency of the person who's using the technology. And
Sure.
the technologist has...
Maybe one
Sorry,
example is that, cars, somebody wants somebody to get somewhere faster, but somebody else wants to drive it through a parade of people.
Yeah, that's the one. I was thinking of something a little bit more optimistic, like, let's see. Well, I guess cars are a good example. There's so auto manufacturers want their cars to sell for more, and so there's all these, like, lobbyists that get laws passed so that you have to have a certain amount of fuel efficiency or a certain, like, fuel efficiency to footprint ratio, and that results in making bigger trucks. And so you have to sell the bigger trucks for more money because they cost more to manufacture, and there's no smaller alternative out there. And but the user, like, I don't want a gigantic trunk that's a boat. I would really like a small Toyota or something, because I don't need to haul a trailer. I just need to, like, put some brush in the back of my truck and use it. And so my agency has been cut out of the loop of technological development, in terms of what vehicles are on the market. No one cares what the actual purchaser with the actual economic value to spend, cares about my vehicle. I have no say. It's the people who are selling them that get to say everything. So there has to be, like, I guess a good way to think about it is there has to be a conversation between the person producing the technology and the person consuming it, so that they can understand each other and they can both, sharpen each other and I guess correct the impulses and the values that are embedded in any given technology. Yeah, there has to be a kill switch, I guess.
Yeah, that's done somewhat through price signals, right? But maybe not enough, right?
Yeah, well, like, take the Hilux. I think it's an Australian car. I mean, it's made by Toyota, but it's $15,000 and it has the exhaust up high so you can drive through huge puddles and it's indestructible and it's an amazing car. It's not available in the United States. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I assume it has something to do with regulations.
I've
Uh,
seen pictures of that car. It's like a truck. I've seen a picture of it like getting unpackaged or being delivered, and it pops up on my feed every now and then. But it looks like a sweet, like military looking car, like a Humvee kind of. It's like, man, I would take one of those. I would buy one right now.
yeah, it's like the older, smaller version of the Toyota Tacoma, with a bunch of features that make it even better. It's like, what's not to love? But it's not available.
Um, Man, we've covered a lot, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'm really grateful for your time. And um, are you um, are you working on anything that people should know about?
Yeah, I'm working on tons of stuff. The main ones are Coracle.social, which is that sort of Twitter clone that we were talking about earlier. Uh, it's I'm pretty happy with it. It's not super duper polished. Um, I think the Twitter use case of social media, I think there's a lot of value to it. But as I've learned more about all the different things to be fixed with social media, I have leaned more towards like how can we cultivate and help communities, real life communities thrive. And so I've moved more from Coracle into another product called Flotilla.social. And that's kind of a Discord alternative. And it's basically a ripoff in terms of design right now from Discord and Slack and Revolt and all those different things. But hopefully over time I can apply some of these ideas that we've been talking about to make it less of something that detracts from communities, or create additional sort of hyper realities and abstractions for people to inhabit, but can pour back into the real world. So that's the goal. Coracle.social, Flotilla.social. Also have a podcast, thank God for NOSTR, where we talk about some of this stuff. And yeah, I mean, reach out if you're interested in running using the community software. I'm happy to set people up and hear back from people who are users. So
Cool. Yeah, and I will put some of those links in the notes and maybe your InPub as well. Um, maybe this is it, and I can edit this out if you want me to. But you also hinted at the idea that you're working on a book.
yes, I am working on a book.
Talk about.
It may be the hardest thing I've ever done. I've rewritten the first chapter twice, and I need to do it again. Yeah, so I'm attempting to write a book, and sort of the thesis statement is that cryptography can solve a lot of what's wrong with the internet as it is. So obviously bringing in a lot of these philosophical ideas that we've been talking about, but also sort of reviving the cypherpunk ethos of the 70s and 80s and 90s. Obviously, that's doing quite well and is very alive and something I'm just being inducted into. So maybe my book will end up being redundant with something else that someone else has written, but approaching it from a Christian point of view to say like, yes, cryptography actually is a solution to a lot of the problems that we see on the internet because it creates what I'm calling cyberspaces. They're limited spheres of influence and of content, and hopefully can allow loop in individual users of the medium to influence the reach of their content, who's intermediating it, who gets to see it, and what they see as well. So putting the power of social media back into the hands of the people who actually have values that they would like to see embodied in the technology that they're using, rather than just be the export for advertising industries. So that's the idea, and that's why I'm reading about Diffie-Hellman and RSA and the history of cryptography. But that'll be out early 2035 or thereabouts.
Wow, I've heard writing a book is really challenging. I think you should keep on it. Don't give up, and people should zap you on NOSTR to support the work that you're doing. And Yeah, man. I've just really enjoyed this conversation and hope to see you again soon at one of the meetups over here.
Yeah, I think that'll happen. Thanks for having me on. It was great talking to you.
Cool, man. Have a good one.